daughter's school, and I read, like, it was an email to parents, and I read it was to parents.
Cute. Well, yeah. I'm amused because our names, we don't think of the meaning of our names, right? My wife's Indian, and in Indian culture, all names have meanings, right? Like my wife's name is Veena. It happens to be a musical instrument. There are names for flowers, religious ceremonies, whatever, right? They're all anklets. Imagine being called anklet. But playing with Zoom. So are we recording?
Yes.
So you were saying about definitions. So we agree that there's debates about definitions because definitions can be negotiated.
Right. So there's debate about a definition as a claim, right? Which is that the definition. I wouldn't say the definition is a claim. I would say the statement that a certain definition should be adopted in that case is the claim. Then and that is not something. Wait, that is not something that should be attached for disambiguation. That to me doesn't help at all with disambiguation.
Right.
It's somebody.
No. It's yeah.
Disambiguation is like what I was saying. You want to take it as an assumption and then vary it so that you can debate based on that interpretation. It's not really an interpretation, but yeah.
And it's true that when I speak of fixing which of the definitions apply, it is always in context. That's fair. Because out of context, in theory, all of them. Now, it's possible that a given argument only makes sense with a subset of the definitions. And so there can be argument about, is this argument, does it still make sense with this definition versus that definition?
That is okay. So
yeah, go ahead.
There's two ways that comes into play, and one is that's simply a relevance debate, right? You know, the most obvious example is when we were talking about Paris the figure versus Paris the city. You know, then somebody makes an argument and you say, no, this is irrelevant. You're talking about a different definition, right? You defeat that argument by just saying it's a non sequitur. No, but then there is the case of a more interesting one, which I just thought about it before and wrote it down. That like this. Remember, there are points.
What you're saying makes sense in context, but we're supposed to be dealing with decontextualized arguments. Like I'm really going with.
What do you mean it makes sense in the context is the disambiguation. We're talking about adding definitions to a claim. It's a disambiguated claim, right? Which means you've defined Paris as the Greek figure.
No, what I'm saying is I have a claim, I haven't disambiguated yet, because I haven't discovered the ambiguity yet. And now I discovered the ambiguity, and so I have to say which it's ambiguous, so I have to say, okay, which of those definitions could still be applicable to that claim? And now each of those could arguably be a relevant statement. There, I'm with you. And so we could discover that only a subset of all possible definitions.
This is to me a process thing, right? The way I imagined it with the curator class, right? Yeah. Is you would do this. You would say, okay, this doesn't have a disambiguation yet, so we're going to have to disambiguate. How am I going to do that? I'm going to make a copy. I'm going to fork, right? And on each version of the fork, I will apply a separate definition.
Right.
Right. Now, that copy inherits the arguments in both cases. And then people can debate or just scoring, if you're doing scoring or whatever, which ones are relevant. I mean, if you were doing an actual curator class, the process of copying, that person could filter out, like, in other words, you're kind of leaving the arguments that make sense to one on one side and moving the arguments that make sense for the other one on the other side. And there's some you need to copy because they're, you know, they have different relevance for the two different cases. But, you know, that's a process.
And what I'm saying is there can be debate about, is this argument really relevant in this case? But I agree with you. It's not how I would do it, because I think the cloning is like, basically you're forcing me to materialize the combinatorics of arguments to each possible interpretation of that claim, whereas the arguments actually only make sense in some cases, and I would tend to not materialize those where it doesn't make sense. But that's a maybe premature optimization. I mean, obviously, there's nothing wrong with what you described. It's just...
Right. No, I get the point. And that's again, that's how it depends on how we design the process that would go into that. Yeah, because if you're going to crowdsource it, you kind of need to have everything there. But if you have an individual who's responsible for that process, they could handpick the ones, and then people can go and add missing ones later or whatever, right? So yeah.
I think even in the crowdsourced process, it's possible to not do this, but this is a purely memory constraint consideration, not abstract model consideration. Yeah, fine. Okay.
So then there's an interesting case that I realized just during our conversation, which is like that, but after disambiguation. In other words, you can have the same situation after disambiguation. The platypus example as an extreme example reminds me that, you know, you could have a debate where you're talking about mammals. You're saying mammals, whatever, mammals are the best. I don't know if they're kingdoms or I don't know where they are.
Genera, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway,
I forgot. Yes.
Yeah, you could say they're the best, and then somebody says, "Yeah, because my favorite animal is the platypus." Now, you could have disambiguated mammal, but your disambiguation, the definition you could have used, might be vague enough as to not state clearly whether or not mammals are or aren't, whether platypus are or aren't mammals, right?
Yeah.
Now that's, and that is exactly what judges do. That is the role of judges in any system, is to take somewhat vague laws and take the history and kind of parse the words and decide what was meant by that, right? Or how we're going to apply that. Now, in this case, you have essentially a vague definition. You're going to have definitions that you have a hierarchy of definitions in terms of some sort of taxonomy or ontology, right?
Yeah.
And then you have a hierarchy in terms of general to specific, in terms of how good a definition it is, how specific a definition is. You could say that, you know, we mean mammal as defined in this document from the 19th century. And that one maybe doesn't consider, I don't know when platypus was integrated, but, you know. But yeah, you get the point. Is you may start seeing the same thing where relevance of a specific argument varies according to whether or not something's matching a definition, as opposed to the thing hasn't been defined, it's not matching a definition. So what is the process in that case? Because you have something quote unquote fully disambiguated, and yet the disambiguation itself is ambiguous.
Well, it's in a way it's not disambiguated because it's disambiguated on, and that goes back to my belief that nothing is ever fully disambiguated, right? It's always disambiguated up to a point that made sense at the time, and then you discover in conversation that actually we need to disambiguate further. And then it becomes process. But I mean, it's always ever process. I don't believe in that state where there's no process.
So the process, I think it falls under the same process too. It's still the disambiguation process, which is if there's no disambiguation there, you probably need to disambiguate by adding as many possible definitions, forking into as many variations you want. And if there's an ambiguous definition, you probably need to fork into multiple more specific versions of that.
And by the way, something I said about that is I would expect, like, I expect the disambiguation, the possible subcategories to go on ad nauseum. Like there's always sub-distinctions that are valid and that are relevant in this case and not in that case, and relevant in this case and not in that case. So that way you keep speaking about forking the claim. And I would tend not to, because I think many of the distinctions are irrelevant. What I would do is say, often the claim is at this broad, vague level, and only this and that distinction are relevant to that claim. But I do not.
You fork. I mean, you can.
It's fork on demand.
Time. Preventative forking, but yeah, it's fork on demand when you see it. The right way to do it, just like refactoring. The right way to refactor is when the problem happens and you say, "Oh, we need to split this into two things."
Precisely. But what I'm saying is the definition may be split in so many ways, and the split does not have to follow all the multiplicity of splits of the definition. Is what I'm saying. It should be possible to keep the claim anchored to, I'm only interested in that split, I'm agnostic about that one.
Yeah, you want the tree to be as sparse as possible, and we need to manage user. And
it's probably going to be a lattice, and it needs to be possible to point to non-leaf nodes in the lattice, is what I'm trying to say.
What needs to point to non-leaf nodes in the lattice?
The disambiguation, the disambiguation, the definition. Like when I'm saying
which means not copying when you fork or whatever, you're not copying the other definitions over or something here. It needs to be a reference.
What I'm saying, it's a reference to, and there's the taxonomy lattice for this term, for this entity, and I need to be able to point to sometimes the top of the lattice, like the term that encapsulates all the variants, or a point or a set of points that encapsulates some of the variants. It doesn't have to be the leaf nodes of the lattice, which are subdivided on all axes.
They're like the concrete implementations of
that's what I'm saying.
Instantiations. I get it. I get the concept. I don't know if it's going to
but this is exactly why I was reacting to the fork will be very costly. It's because I expect the lattice to be huge.
I would try to avoid premature optimization in the sense that we know it'll be a problem, but at first we need to at least
there's a difference between avoiding premature optimization and not avoiding known disasters. And for me, this one totally.
I understand. Yeah, but as a group, we run into this a lot as a problem with the group here, in that some of us don't envision the disaster yet, like haven't gone through that. And so like in that case, it's easier to default to the, programming. A lot of times it's just make it work. And then we'll make it work nicely. Once people have gone through the exercise,
make it work well, make it work fast.
Exactly.
Classic, yes. And I'm saying, well, this doesn't work well enough. Been there, done that. Bought the T-shirt. It's a disaster. my experience of that has been in grammar, in pure grammar parsing. The number of combinatorial ways to parse a sentence can be absolutely scary.
And that is one of those points where I haven't thought through it enough. So, you may need to walk me through that process before I accept, That's exactly the case, where maybe try not to optimize with me until I'm ready for it. I'll resist because I don't see,
you don't see the need, yeah,
or the better solution, right? That covers, yeah. So yeah, and so one of the topics that I would like to discuss at a very initial level, and you're bringing up a second one, right? One is, okay, well, how does a definition get a disambiguation get created and improved in the system? And the second one, which is tied to that, and also even closer to what you're saying, is, along the theme ream idea, is, what are the essential elements of a claim? Because I think that disambiguation needs to connect to that.
I'm very much, I did give the reference to the SOA paper, and I'm very much getting back into the SOA mindset, and I think there's a lot to learn there. And he's been thinking very much along prologue lines. And so you get these, and the main point of prologue is variable unification across predicates, right? You have a variable that represents an entity, and then you have a predicate which uses these variables, and you reuse a variable across predicates to say that this is the same entity using in those two predicates, right? So at the most basic level, what's a claim? The theme ream is actually only valid for some of them. But when I say the table is blue, there's a theme ream, very much. But there's a basic unit before that, which is the existence statement. There exists something that is a table. So the predicate itself, SOA says that the predicate itself carries the existential quantifier, or at least I would say when asserted, it carries the existential quantifier, not when quoted, of course. And he actually has the notion of nested spaces. He's got a graph notation, which is quite fascinating, where he has a space, like kind of, when you put a sentence on the page, it's asserted. If you put a shaded oval and put the sentence inside the shaded oval, it's kind of negated. It's kind of a counterfactual space. But then you can have an unshaded oval within the shaded oval, and then it becomes an if-then structure. So the if clause is in the shaded oval, and the then is in the inside unshaded oval. And so there's a kind of unity between negation and conditional, which I'm still wrapping my head around. But that's not the point. The point is, when something is asserted on the page, he says there's, we use the verb to be in three senses, right? Something exists, there's a predication, the table exists, the table is blue, and these are the same, these two are the same table, like equality. And that's the three meanings of to be. And what he's saying is, if you think of the predicate as having this implicit existential quantifier, it makes a lot of things easier. But that means when I claim there's a table, there's no theme ream. It's a kind of atomic existential claim. And then when you say the table is blue, you have theme ream. You're saying this table, which I named before and maybe in the same sentence, moreover is blue. And then, is it a primary or secondary quality? In the sense, if that were true, would I change my mind about what entity this is versus an attribute? If I say there's a plate on the table is blue. No, it's not blue, it's green. You can still imagine the plate on the table. there's no reason for you to change that. It's still the same table. If I'm saying there's a plate on the table, the table is on this thing. Okay, this thing is a table and it's got a plate on it. No, actually, it's not a table. It doesn't stand on the ground. Like, oh, is it a table then if it doesn't stand on the ground? What is it? And can it hold something if it's not standing on the ground? Or, you know, this is not a best example, but I'm trying to say there's statements.
Those statements sound like they're arguments. There are other claims that can impact a previous claim, but
the distinction I'm trying to make, and that's not a distinction SOA makes, but what I find interesting is when you have contradictions, are they threatening the identity of the entities or not? Because the reality is, and this I think is what Stephen was saying when he said, I think entities are claims. I'll put it another way. I think names are unary predicates. Names, you know, my name, Marc-Antoine, is a predicate that makes an existential statement that there's somebody or there's something which carries this name and is uniquely determined by this name. Of course, there's more than one Marc-Antoine, but still, the notion of name in a given context is that it's supposed to be unnamed. It's a definite article.
Well, in contracts, it's a whole paragraph, right? It's more than just your name. It's
because you want to
you want to point directly at that entity.
Without
ambiguity.
And so you accumulate disambiguating primary characteristics. And what I'm saying is, if any of those primary predicates were wrong, you're not speaking about the same person. If it turns out it's not the same social identity number, it's someone else, right? Unless the person is a spy and has a forged, there's always rebuttals, but forget those. What I'm saying is, if there's a Marc-Antoine with another Marc-Antoine in Canada, of which there's plenty, thank you, and I say I'm entering a contract with Marc-Antoine and social insurance number is this, and then
I'm thinking of like Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Nobody knows for sure who that person is, but there you can talk about and make claims about Satoshi, right? And some of them is that person, but also Satoshi did this or meant this, intended this.
This is a brilliant example, and I'm trying to make the difference between, and I'm not sure this is a case of that difference, between definite and indefinite article. Like, we know when we use my name, we know who it's referring to. And right now we can say I have black hair. As my hair turns white, that's a secondary characteristic. It's still me. Whereas, again, if it's a different birth date, well, it's someone else who happens to have the same name. Satoshi Nakamoto here, we don't even know who it is. It's just the person who wrote that article and code and who goes by that name in certain circles. And if it turns out the article is a collective work, Satoshi Nakamoto doesn't exist, right? So that's a really interesting case in point of we have an assumed unique existential quantifier, but that could fall with more evidence. If the article is collective, then no, we're talking actually about a group and not a person. So we have a very different idea about who the author of that article is. The person is an assumed, the single personhood is an assumed primary characteristic. And if that is false, then it totally changes our idea about who the entity is. On the other hand, one of the co-authors could say, I'm among the authors, so I fit the author of the article. Predicate. So some predicates, and that's the idea, every predicate, some of them have an implied existential quantifier. There's at least one person. In some cases, that quantifier has a uniqueness clause. There's only one person with this characteristic. But in some other instances, we're interested not in this entity who happens to fit that predicate, but we're interested in the collection of all entities fitting that predicate, which is a very different entity, of course, a higher order variable. And that's a distinct case. If I say this table is blue, blue is the predicate blue, here applies to that single table entity. If I say all blue things or all blue tables, which is a more restricted, that's a group. And it's also an entity. It can bear a role in certain arguments. All blue tables, something or other. That's higher order logic. We have collections. Universal quantifiers. Does the Haas still apply? Question making sense?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just
okay.
No,
so,
I'm thinking through some tough stuff right now.
Good. So the question is, we can certainly reduce names to predicates. Do we want the predicate to be the basic building block? Maybe. Certainly, predicate and variable unification. What is known as a casting in topic maps, right? Saying this actor plays that role in that relation. So predicates would be like relations in topic maps. Now claims, as I said, there's a minimal claim in the single existential predicate, but the Riem theme is really is a important subcases of claims where you extend the theme with the Riem. So there's more than one predicate, but they share the same casting. Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot to chew on here, but you know, one of the things is like exploring the things that can happen, as you said, to a claim if our knowledge of an entity, a disambiguation, changes, right?
Yeah.
Some of them need to be included in regular argumentation. Because things can change over time, right?
Yeah.
There's just, you know, I expect this to happen and this will happen in 5 months. Well, you come back 5 months later and it didn't happen. Somebody can argue back, it didn't happen. And ends the argument. You were wrong. You know, the argument was, was live at one point and now it's like, boom, here's the final counter argument. It didn't happen. Okay.
Of course it did. Fake news.
Fraud.
Sorry.
Yeah. So the debate can go on, but anyway, it evolves through adding more claims and arguments, right? Following regular argumentation.
Absolutely.
There's the question of who is Satoshi Nakamoto and what did they intend? So you can say, well, you know, what if you say Satoshi Nakamoto wrote the white paper?
Right.
Okay, that's a claim, right? What do we mean by Satoshi in this place? If in most places we use Satoshi Nakamoto as the definition being the person that wrote the first white paper on Bitcoin or whatever, then that claim, what is the Satoshi Nakamoto in that claim? If you use Satoshi Nakamoto is the one that wrote the white paper as the definition, then you've just created a tautology that is not worth discussing.
But if you, this sounds like a
but if you say, but it becomes an interesting debate if you say that Satoshi Nakamoto is an anonymous single person. If that's your definition for that,
that's a very good.
Well, then your debates become about, in fact, it becomes about the definition by saying, no, the white paper was written by a group of people. Here's evidence that it was written by a group of people. So in that case, you know, again, what hasn't happened is it hasn't changed definitions. You have to disambiguate your claim with a definition that doesn't make it a tautology. And then really what you're saying is, instead of saying Satoshi Nakamoto wrote the white paper, you're really saying the white paper on Bitcoin was written by a single person, is really the claim you're making. And you've used the alias Satoshi Nakamoto. I don't know.
Yeah, and this is all the question of implicitness, right? It's the claim at first was a tautology, but there were a bunch of implied claims, such as single personhood. And I don't think that's disambiguation, that's implied. It's a slightly different thing. Now, I don't know about disambiguating a tautology, but saying, I'm not sure what is the meaning of Satoshi Nakamoto wrote that paper, other than asserting the authorship, evidence as stated.
Well, you could be trying to say, that it was written by somebody else and Satoshi Nakamoto stole it, plagiarized it, and published it, right? That could be what the
distinguishing the author and publisher. That's a good one. That's a very good one. That's another implicit. But then
it's wrote versus Then you have to disambiguate wrote, right?
Yeah, no, but it's when I say Satoshi Nakamoto, do I implicitly mean the person who wrote it or the person who published it?
I mean, until you disambiguate. Right.
But the idea is, I'm not aware of the possibility of ambiguity at the moment I make the statement. And the reality is,
right.
What's happening psychologically is I have to replace an ambiguous statement by either by one or two less ambiguous statements in my mind. Two because I don't know, or one because I have a clear idea on this, and maybe. But either way, I'm replacing. That's what's happening in my mind. I'm replacing a statement, which I didn't realize was ambiguous, by a less ambiguous statement. And I'm saying not doing that in the canonical debate, not realizing that here we're replacing an ambiguous statement by a less ambiguous statement can be a mistake. Now, in this case, and I think
you would see it coming up with the arguments again. It would be the arguments would show confusion. How would you disambiguate? You could say the definition of Satoshi Nakamoto is the specific user account, right? Or it could be something more conceptual. Satoshi Nakamoto as described in this article,
right? As the author of the paper, the publisher of the paper, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And there's all these assumptions, and this is why variable unification is so important. There's all these predicates which are conflated because we suppose it's the same person until we question the variable unification. That's really interesting. In the case of an unknown entity, it's much easier to question, but I mean, it's even with known entities, right? There was a historical Shakespeare. We know exactly who he is. We could even do a DNA analysis if we wanted to, but there's still debate about whether he's the author of the plays or partially or blah blah. This one
or only some of them, or exactly. But you can make the claim that William Shakespeare wrote whatever play. And somebody could say,
it's a claim. It's a valid claim, and here there's not too much ambiguity on the play. I agree with you.
Well, there is. It's the same situation, because it's like, well, what do you mean by William Shakespeare? Do you mean William Shakespeare as entitled, when you buy the book, or do you mean the William Shakespeare as identified genetically through this line, who is that person, right? Because William Shakespeare is a concept as well as a physical person, right?
No, exactly.
That's why there's debate about, I mean, the original physical William Shakespeare wrote that play as opposed to somebody else using his name, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you. It can be an ambiguous claim, but it can be a non-ambiguous claim in that we are able to designate the historical William Shakespeare in a way that's not ambiguous. We're able to say, we're speaking about this person. Right. And if the author is someone else, maybe we can or cannot designate that person. But when we know that we agree on who that historical figure is, we know who it is. Maybe we don't agree on the characteristics. Maybe we find out that he had this or that characteristic that we would not attribute to William Shakespeare, but it's changing our idea of what kind of person he is, but it's not changing the identity. And that's what I meant by, primary and secondary characteristic.
Here's an example. What I'm thinking about here is that this is a claim that can be partially wrong. When you talk about it conversationally, somebody says, William Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. That can be partially wrong in several ways. You could say, yes, the name attributed to the writing of that is William Shakespeare. So you're right about that, but actually it was somebody else using his name that he allowed to use his name. Or, it's the same thing. Actually, some other person, he partially wrote it because somebody else partially wrote it as well.
He plagiarized the idea from Commedia dell'arte.
Yeah. Yeah, well, then there's that. Well, but that's still writing, yeah. It depends on what you meant by write.
Yeah, but what do you mean by
what do you mean by write? And the way this would be reflected, like conversationally, you can say, yeah, you're partly right or whatever. But the way I see it as coming out in the canonical debate is all those claims that can share that sentence, but have very specific meanings. Some of them are true and some of them are false.
And there I'm with you, actually.
Yeah.
I want to contextualize those claims, but other than that, I'm totally with you. Having a distinction between the various claims. Where I'm not with you is having, like, there's so many meanings of Shakespeare, there's so many meanings of writing, so many, and even The Tempest, which edition? And doing combinatorics on that, I think, is prohibitive. Whereas if we can say, here I'm varying on what we mean by Shakespeare or by writing, but I'm keeping the other things vague, and I'm okay with vague because it is valid for most other meanings.
Right. There's, so a concept I wanted to explore here. I'm trying to come up with a good example to illustrate it, but like I'm thinking of Nakamoto's Satoshi Nakamoto again, and it's the concept of, is it a single person or is it a collective? Let's say that you use the definition Satoshi Nakamoto as the account that published the white paper, right? The person that wrote the white paper. And you make I'm trying to figure out a claim where this might fall apart, right? It would be like so-and-so. Okay.
Okay, let's get into it. Okay, I think I can, but
I know it would, and this gets maybe into where a definition has claim territory, sort of. What if you define Satoshi Nakamoto as the collective that wrote something, right? In other words, you presuppose it must be a collective, and now you're saying that the collective that wrote this white paper intended this, right? That's your claim. Now, later on, it's proven that Satoshi was never a collective and was one single person that wrote the whole thing. What does that do to those claims and to that definition of Satoshi as a collective?
Perfectly valid question, and I agree, interesting one. Okay, first, what is the relationship between claims, predicates, and definitions? I would actually argue that definitions are predicates, predicate claims. Like you're saying, this predicate is true of this entity, this predicate is true of this entity, and we have more than one, and often some of them are implicit, like the example of author, publisher, and so on. And here we have author of that paper as a predicate. It's a relational predicate. And we have a variable that is the author and another variable that is bound to the paper, and the paper is thankfully easier to pinpoint because it's an immutable data object. And this variable can be bound to either collective, individual, and then various claims can be made about it either way. But the point is, if you have Satoshi as a collective and Satoshi as an individual, some predicate, like in one case, there's the collective predicate and the individual predicate. They're part of the predicates which are part of those definitions. But other predicates will be shared between those two definitions. I can say, for example, that it turns out the author and the publisher are the same. Now that, okay, no, that's not bad. That's a bad example because it only works for the individual, because publisher is an individual. What else? I could say the author had a very good grasp of this branch of mathematics, right? Or the author did not have a high regard for energy costs. This is true whether now those are maybe secondary characteristics, but what I'm saying is these can apply to either the individual or collective. Or I could say the authors.
Well, you could say, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is Satoshi Nakamoto, regardless of whether it was a person or a group, obviously intended that, or obviously didn't care about the energy cost of mining, right?
Exactly. But here I can state it regardless, which is one perfectly valid claim to do, or I can have done it kind of separately. Like I said it in the individual case and I said it in the collective case. And then we realize, oh, guess what? This predicate can be factored out because it's true regardless of the individual collective value.
So one of the, so you have a hierarchy there of definitions, which is Satoshi regardless, and then you have Satoshi as individual, and you have Satoshi as a collective. And what if one of the arguments is actually Satoshi as a collective probably involved this person, and I saw in one of their emailings online a discussion of how do we reduce the energy cost in the future once this thing gets off the ground, right? So as an individual, this person doesn't fit in to that group, but as a collective fits in. So you have three claims, and then you have an extra claim, which is that this person was part of the Satoshi collective. And the Satoshi collective did care about it, but you know,
I don't even see a contradiction, to be honest.
I don't see a contradiction. I'm picturing modeling it and organizing it. That's
yeah.
Tough thing. Yeah.
I don't see a contradiction. Just to be clear, because you can have emergent behavior of a collective which is not carried by any individual in the collective. Mm-hmm. I can say the collective did not care about, even if all of its members cared about it, but the dynamics of the collective made it such that the emergent property is it didn't care as a collective. But I'm
no, it's this is all important and interesting. I have a hard stop now, so I gotta go.
Yeah, so good.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff too we didn't like. I would like to get into how we define.
But just one last thing is that this is why I speak about lattice. The definition has a bunch of these properties, and each of those properties define a distinction, and we have a lattice of distinction, and those properties are independent, potentially. Yeah. Okay, wrap up.
All right. Until next time. Bye.
Yep.
Bye, Bentley. Thanks.